Okay, you ready? Here we go into week 3, everybody. And this will be a fun week because many of you are foodies, and the fire chakra is so much about food, digestion. And so let's continue on that theme from week 2 when we were drilled into digestion, and now we look at the inputs to the digestive process. So let's just do a quick backtrack. The root is about protein. The flow is about fats and oils. And the fire chakra is about carbohydrate. And so as you probably have surmised, so many people have issues not just with their fire center, but also their connection and relationship with carbohydrate. Often we are told to avoid carbohydrate. And so there's this carbohydrate phobia. And in fact, it's one of the things that it frustrates me a bit because carbohydrates aren't everything. They're in plants. They're in, I think that if people are wanting to be more specific about the type of carbohydrate, that's good. But when we just clear out one entire macronutrient, it's just, first of all, it's not plausible. It's not reasonable. And most of us aren't doing that anyway. So why create this phobia around carbohydrate? I think that there's a way to champion carbohydrates in order to fuel our fire best. So that's what I want to cover. If you remember from the Nourish Your Whole Self deck, there are many different elements to fire in the food and eating process. Everything from how we think about food. If you connect the mental energy that we have associated with our fire center, and then think about our thoughts about food, whether they're perfectionistic, opinionated, righteous, whatever, which is, part of the liberation for me, letting go of dietary dogma in the way of adhering to a certain tribal thought pattern, is that it releases not just from the root chakra, but also from the fire. Because when we hold in a lot of these judgments, it creates a lot of mental tension, right? So if I'm eating a certain way and somebody else is not eating like me, then I carry that energetic lineage and that feeling. And that can be a lot for the fire to hang on to. We're going to talk about sweeteners and sweetness, about foods that allow you to radiate. Most people don't think that when they're eating that they are getting something in the process, and that what's in the process is this idea of superfood and how we can feel more like a superhero, a super person when we have foods that invigorate our fire. I think it's interesting as a culture how so many of us are gravitating, including myself, to superhero movies. There's a preponderance of them out there. Everything from Shazam, Captain Marvel, Wonder Woman, the Hulk. I've seen a lot of these, and there's an archetypal message of having a person who is in the normal day-to-day, all of a sudden transform, whether it's Superman transforming into the cape, Spider-Man going into his garb, Wonder Woman who transforms when she turns around into, this magical creature. Whatever it is, we all have that inner superpower. And I do think that with the emergence of a lot of these superfoods, that the goal is to really harness that. And many of us are eating foods that aren't giving us our superpowers. So I kind of like to think about the fire chakra as a superpower center. So healthy carbohydrates sustain my inner energy. We talk about the different types of carbohydrate in this webinar. And we've already been talking about transformation and digestion. So we've been there. So now let's go deeper into foods. We will talk about yellow foods. This is just high level at this point. So as I mentioned, there's a color code to the colors of food. So red, inflammation; orange, reproductive health. And what I see for yellow is digestive health. So when I look at the constituents of these different beautiful yellow colored foods, I began thinking about all the different things that they connect in the way of prebiotic fibers. Like bananas are such a good source of prebiotic fibers, as are a lot of the whole grains and legumes. Some of them contain enzymes like pineapple. Some contain acid like lemons. And so there are different functions, and I kind of get into all the science of that in this article. I talk a bit about it in the Rainbow Diet book, but I'm presenting it here to you for you to think about. So again, that there's a color signature to each of these food categories. Even though they're seemingly disparate foods, there seem to be, at least in my opinion, this is how I see it, that there are common threads and scientific patterns. So I've got listed here some of the foods and some of the select nutrients that may have some of these activities, these functions that are listed at the top. So the spectrum of food and supplements, as I think about the fire system, the fire chakra, is, as I mentioned, dietary carbohydrate, which we're going to dive into first. We'll talk about healthy sweeteners. Whole grains and legumes and fibers belong here. Specifically soluble fiber, not insoluble fiber. Insoluble fiber is the broom-like fiber that sweeps through the GI tract and helps with elimination. That is part of the root. Soluble fiber traps, swells, and will trap things like toxins, will trap things like blood, or not blood, glucose from food, so it doesn't end up in the blood so quickly. So soluble fiber plays a role here, and we know of the role of soluble fiber in balancing blood sugar, satiety, helps us to feel a sense of fullness. And then, of course, we'll cover off on select yellow-colored foods. So let's look at the spectrum. You know, one of the things that I like to do as a nutritionist is to focus not just on the actual physical nutritive qualities of food and macronutrients, phytonutrients, vitamins, minerals, all of that, but the emotional, mental, and energetic aspects of food, which I don't think we do enough of. Traditional medicine systems like traditional Chinese medicine and even Ayurveda are really good about that. So we have the spectrum here where we have the fear of carbohydrate, where we kind of close down to it. And then we start to do more of things like fat and protein. We go into our lower chakras. We go into the root. We go into the flow in a very excessive way. And we don't bring enough of our energy up and out. And then there is, on the other side of the spectrum, if we go to the other side of the pendulum, we have for the times that we might feel stressed and overburdened and burnt out in our fire, we might feel more drawn to things that give us energy, quick fix energy. And for some people, they don't have the awareness that they have this over dependence on quick burning, highly processed carbohydrate foods. And it's basically, to me, it's an indicator that their fire is out of balance. It's not about the carbohydrate. The carbohydrate is a patch to help their fire. And most likely, these people have impaired digestion. There are metabolic issues, whether metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes. And oftentimes we can be constitutionally primed in that direction. Like my body, my genes, I mean, I have diabetes and metabolic issues are rampant in my family, especially my dad's family. And so that's something I always have to keep a pulse on, is like, I know that ancestrally that my relatives are imprinted with issues with fire. So it causes me to really keep check on that, to make sure I'm turning the dial down on these things. So where we really want to be is somewhere in the middle. And I love the Goldilocks analogy here, because that having that just right feel about carbohydrate, wherever that is. And you know what? Day to day, that can be very different. We might be feeling like on one day we need a little bit more of more simple, quick burning carbohydrate than others. It's almost like trying to figure out what kind of fuel we need. If we were to think about this purely from like a car analogy, what fuel will help us to burn our brightest? And oftentimes I think we need an amalgam of different things. So the energy of carbohydrate is, it's fiery. Carbohydrate, it is quick burning for the most part. So what can happen is, if we think of a spectrum, having that burn, that flame, that energy feels really good, but it can come at a cost. And so if I think of gold currency, I'm trying to use metaphors that align to this fire center. So things that are gold and burning and bright. currency, energy, exchange. There's an exchange when we have carbohydrate. And so, yes, they may be glitzy and gold and very attractive because they taste good, and inherently we are primed for sweetness. And we see that even with infants, that infants will go towards things that are sweet. It is important for our survival to have things that are sweet. We can't negate that. And the more that we shut that off, the more that we want it. There are very interesting studies showing how when you give people savory foods for days on end, that they start to crave sweet foods. If you give people sweet foods days on end, they develop this sweet fatigue, and then they start craving savory. So our bodies in general, we need all tastes, and one is not better than the other. One is not evil compared to the other. What I really liked when I went to Nepal was that the way that they eat in Nepal is with small containers at every meal with a variety of tastes. So I never felt like I left a meal without that sense of completeness. It's like my taste buds were all having a party, every patch of them. So carbohydrate is good stuff if we know how to use it for fuel. So if we overuse carbohydrates, certain carbohydrates, it can rob us of our energy. And, this whole thing with, because it's so powerful, it can create a lot of movement. And if we're taking in too much carbohydrate, especially simple carbohydrate, and it's not taken up by the cells as energy, whether we have insulin issues or whether we just don't need all that energy, so then it starts to get shunted into different tissues. What can happen is we create the flux of insulin, right? Insulin is what shuttles the carbohydrate into the cells. And with that influx of insulin, we get an influx of growth factors. And in a normal world, growth factors are good. We need growth factors to grow. But when we're an adult and we have excessive amounts of growth factors because of our meals, this can lead to a more proliferative and even a more, a state of overgrowth. And so if you think of the connection between sugar and cancer as an example, that's something that we hear that's pervasive. And we can even bring the fire down to the root and talk about how these carbohydrates, especially simple sugars, can start to alter our immune activity. And often that is through that nexus of glucose, insulin, and cortisol. Cortisol belonging to the root, and the glucose and the insulin belonging to the fire. There's that special triad. And in functional medicine, that's a really big deal. That's a big triad to portal into the whole body system with. Because if we are in the mode of following our blood sugar, which is really important, but we're not tracking our insulin together with it, we don't get a sense of how our body is shuttling and utilizing carbohydrate. So fasting insulin is as important to me, in my mind, based on my functional medicine training, as fasting blood sugar. The two go hand in hand. That's like the fire within us burns depending on our interrelationship between glucose and insulin. And many practitioners within functional medicine, I have a good colleague friend of mine who uses glucose and insulin as her entire doorway of entry into the rest of the body, whether she's talking sex hormones or she's getting into cardiovascular disease, it doesn't matter. Her portal of entry, she always wants to be sure, coming from the place of fire, that she deals with sugar and insulin in the body. And I think she has a point. I'm not a practitioner that, just kind of drills into one particular thing and then maps out from there. I more or less go with the 7 systems and see what's most out of balance, and I go with that. But for some practitioners, you can't really go wrong in doing that. I do think it's a great focal point, especially since the fire part of us is so much a staple way of how we operate. So it makes sense to work from that place of glucose and insulin. In fact, I look forward to the day that we are able to quickly, without a finger prick, get our glucose levels. And I know that various technologies are being worked on now with just using light, using things like a smartphone or an external device. There are continuous glucose monitors. And I think that that's really the wave of the future, is to be looking at not just a pinpoint in time. We want to know how our blood sugar changes throughout the day. So there are some of my colleagues who have been having fun, if you will, with continuous glucose monitors, which get strapped onto you. I mean, they're not fun to wear, and I haven't done this myself, but I just know you can find out so much information about yourself based on looking at your sleep patterns, what you're eating, how you are before, how you are during, how you are after. You can be tracking your blood sugar throughout the day, and blood sugar tracks to energy level. So you could see how that is super fiery, right? Is to know your blood sugar, know your insulin, and match it to your energy. So with high glycemic index type products, where we get an infiltration of energy, there's a cost. Sure, we could take it in, but there's something that is given out in return. And oftentimes that is our energy. So we get that huge spike of glucose that comes in from these highly processed foods that are already kind of broken down and human made to the point that they just rapidly come into the body. And then the cost to our body is to squeeze insulin out from the pancreas, from the beta cells, in order to shuttle this stuff into cells. It's all well and good if we're using the energy. And I think of athletes, I think of, runners or people who have high energy demands. And some of these processed quick sweeteners might be favorable for them because they need quick energy. And their body is just like, give me the energy so I can perform. And their insulin is sensitive in its production because they are so metabolically fit. It's not to say that all athletes are metabolically fit. I do think that there's a strain that can be put, an oxidative stress strain, an intestinal permeability strain that can be put on high intensity athletes who do sporadic or intermittent type of very high intense activities, right? Like I think of Ironman. There was a study I remember that people that did Ironman had intestinal hyperpermeability after the event. So, but sometimes we need that energy. So the energetics of different types of carbohydrates, I think it's important to make the distinction between naturally occurring whole food-based carbohydrates, i.e. things like vegetables, i.e. things like fruits. I don't know what it is with so many people being against fruit. I see it as a very important piece. If you look at the science of fruits and vegetables, they kind of go together. Oftentimes, studies are looking at fruits and vegetables in unison. And sometimes you'll have certain studies just on fruits or certain studies just on vegetables. But mostly, if you do a PubMed search on fruits and vegetables, they occur together. So when we need simple sugars and we need something quick and burning, why not reach for something like a fruit, which has the soluble fiber, it's got the skin and the phytonutrients, it's got the minerals and vitamins, it's got the adjunctive pieces to those simple sugars that give us energy. And vegetables, of course, not always being as sweet hedonically, but providing some fibers. And I think what happened with a lot of the human-made products, and I've had the experience of working for a large food giant company that made ready-to-eat cereals. And so what happens with ready-to-eat cereals is you create, in your own mind, a formulation which might resemble something in nature, but then optimize in order to give you the best of all worlds. And we know that a lot of these ready-to-eat cereals have a high glycemic impact. They have added fiber to them in some ways, but that's why I just like to stick to what nature provides. So I would ask you to ask yourself whether or not you fear carbohydrates. And if you are diabetic, you have metabolic syndrome, you have some health condition, there might be a bit of that fear. I mean, it's something that is on my radar because I know I have a very strong family history of those conditions. Not to say that I'm fearful, but they're on my radar, and I'm conscientious about what I'm taking in. So why are some people heavy on carbohydrates in their diet and feel fixated? So this is the reverse. So let's look at even your intake of carbohydrate. Give yourself some opportunity to be looking at that. And then it's kind of like fats and oils. Why is there's a lack of deep understanding as to what carbohydrates really do and what they're about, all the different types, all the different families, how we can use them effectively. So rather than cast them out as villains, how do we create a better relationship with them? So one of the things that we do in the nutrition physical exam, and I talk about this in the certification course that I do on food and spirit, is to look at where in the body there is stagnation and stuckness. And if we look at the place of fire, we've got the upper torso area, which if we look at much of the literature on metabolic syndrome, one of the factors of metabolic syndrome is looking at increased adipose tissue in this area. And I would say as an adjunct to that, increased liver fat deposition. So when the liver becomes fatty, and this is called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD, and more people are getting fatty liver. One of the ways that we can test that indirectly is looking at liver function tests. So when the liver becomes infiltrated with fat, it's not a happy camper, because the liver is it's about dispersing fat, not accumulating fat. So when we start to get more fat in this area, adipose tissue close to our viscera, this is seen to be more metabolically important than if we have adipose tissue in other parts of our body. As an example, like in functional medicine, we talk about the location of gynoid having more fat localized into hips and buttocks, which is seen to be less of a metabolic insult than having fat up in your upper torso, right? And the issue there is just bringing in more inflammatory cytokines into your viscera. So to be thinking about just even location, right? Location of where there is stagnation, stuckness. And again, it jives all very well with metabolic syndrome. So that's what I start to think of with high carbohydrate. And high carbohydrate in general, and most people don't realize, it converts very readily to triglycerides. And when we have high triglycerides in the blood, this can lead to higher triglycerides in liver. So if we look at the carbohydrate family tree here, there are many different families within the big family. We have off to the left, we've got the more simple sugars, and off to the right, more of the complex carbohydrates. And under each of these, you can see where you can have different effects of the different family members. And, I'm not going to take you through all of this. It's most important to realize, I think, the balance of these and how bringing in the sustainable carbohydrates, the more complex array, which look like little sugar units that are branched out for better metabolizing, that they can help with processing of some of the more simple sugars. So it's more complex, but carbohydrates can give us satiety. They can help to feed our microbiome. And what I did here is I give you a list from this particular journal of the different classes of carbohydrate and what are the principal components. So again, I'm not going to tour you through this, but some of you are in the nutrition field and you're kind of interested in some of this, and some of you aren't in the nutrition field, but you're still really interested. The only one here that I want to bring up, because most people don't realize it, and it's on a lot of processed food products and even dietary supplements, is maltodextrin. Maltodextrin, when you see that on a label, any dextrin is a fragmented, smaller carbohydrate chain. So what I tend to see it in is things like stevia packets, where they have maltodextrin as a carrier for the stevia, which you only need a small amount. So the maltodextrin gives it the bulk. So you're actually changing that glycemic impact of stevia when you do that. If you have the maltodextrin, it is just higher in glycemic impact as a more pre-digested starch. So on that note of talking about sweeteners, let's dive into glycemic index just a little bit. This is a known metric for assessing in a more standardized way the effect of sugar and or carbohydrate on our blood sugar. So typically the referenced food is either white bread or granulated sugar, and everything is compared against that. And so generally there are foods that fall into low, medium, and high glycemic index. So you can see here with the red line, you can see how it goes up and down when we have a high glycemic index food. And when it's a lower glycemic impact food, it's not as high as the high one. And so you don't get the squeezing out of all that insulin. So I like to talk about high glycemic index foods as a roller coaster. It's kind of like we can get that feeling of going high and getting all that energy and really feeling like the thrill of being on a roller coaster, if you've ever had that experience, and kind of like the adrenaline that gets cranked out. And then we slowly dip down. And then sometimes when you get off that roller coaster, you feel kind of dizzy and disoriented. It's very similar, actually, when we continue to spike our blood sugar over and over again. And now what we know is that it is better for us longer term not to have the injury of spewing out lots of insulin and growth factors with a high glycemic meal. So to moderate that into rolling hills, like driving through the countryside on a Sunday, and the kind of feeling you get from that versus being on the thrill of a roller coaster and all the, well, sure, excitement, but also apprehension, cortisol. The high blood sugar tracks with inflammation. So that's another reason why this line, I like that it's in red, because it's a good reminder that the root and fire are very connected. So naturally occurring and synthetic sweeteners are out there. There are lots of different names of sweeteners. Are they all the same? No, they all have different energy. Again, let's talk energetics of food. If we have something that's artificial, does it truly have the same energetic property? The essence of it, is it the same as a piece of fruit? And I would say no, it's been chemically synthesized. We have chemical compounds that look like what is in nature, but have been modified by adding a chlorine or a hydrogen or a sodium group, whatever it is. Reflect on that. What is the energy of something that is chemically created versus something natural? And fortunately, there are more studies coming out on artificial sweeteners. And, typically the way that things have been historically launched into the market is there's an artificial sweetener of some type. Let's just take sucralose because it's so common these days. And what's really interesting is that if you go into the grocery store and you look at all the sweeteners, a preponderance of them are in yellow packages. There are some baby blue and light pink, and it all kind of feels nice. It's interesting, the marketing into sugar, pastels, but primarily yellow. In Splenda is definitely packaged in yellow. It's like a big smiley face. So these products get launched, back to Splenda, right? Back to sucralose. The way that was created, if you look into the history of it was being created as a pesticide. The scientists happened to taste it. I don't know why any scientist would have done that. Found it was sweet. It was tested to be and found to be non-toxic in animal models at higher levels, was launched into the market, and now we see the sequelae of physiological effects that are now resulting in people with use. And so we see things like neurological issues, headaches. We see things like changes in the gut microbiome, which is a big deal now that we know what goes on with the gut microbiome, right? The other thing I want to do is connect cravings for sweet foods with other lifestyle factors. So this is more of a fire insight connection. This is an interesting study in which they took 31 teenagers between 14 and 17 in age. They had 3 weeks where they had a baseline week, and then they had 5 nights in a row of short sleep duration, so 6.5 hours, and then a healthy sleep duration, something like 10 hours. And then they had a 2-night washout period and a 5-night crossover. So every person was their own control. That's like one of the best study designs, when you're your own control. So they're comparing these teenagers, looking at sleep restriction, healthy sleep, and then they show them pictures of foods. And what they find is that the teenagers that had less sleep found images of food that were sweet to be more appealing. So there's something that happens to us when we're not having enough sleep, right? We start to get more cravings, especially for things that are more glycemic. They are, and I think because we're being thrown off with low sleep, we start to change blood sugar. We become more vulnerable to these cortisol, insulin, and blood glucose shifts. So I thought it was really interesting how they were looking at just even something as simple as a couple of nights of impaired sleep and how that primed somebody's inclination and hunger response towards sweet foods in a very different way. And why would that be? Well, if you wake up from a night of poor sleep and you're not sleeping enough, you're fatigued already. You start with low fire. And so now what's going to fuel your fire? Well, the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. Literally and figuratively, getting some energy through carbohydrate. So that's where fibers come in. Fibers are like the saving grace of carbohydrate when we couple them with things like sweeteners, because fiber creates the slow-mo approach. Thank goodness for fiber, because fiber helps to better manage our fire. I think it's one of like the best things that people can do in order to get back into balance. Soluble fiber is the type of fiber that swells with water or liquid. And what happens with that soluble fiber is it traps things, slows the release of sugar from food into the bloodstream. So that's good. Gives you a sense of satiety. And then insoluble fiber belongs to the root system. Insoluble is more like the broom. It does not swell. It has mechanical, it has that motility that the gut needs to move things along. So what are some insoluble sources? Things like wheat bran. And mostly what you're going to find in the plant kingdom is nature gives us the best of both. Most foods are combinations of insoluble and soluble fibers. So it's really hard to say only this food is insoluble, unless you have a supplement product where it's a wheat bran supplement, which will predominate in insoluble fiber. So what I put for you here is a very simple chart, because I don't want you to forget about fiber. I do think it's very important, and most people don't get enough. It serves so many functions. It's one of the gifts of the fruits and vegetables and legumes and whole grains from nature. It increases food volume, gives satiety, a sense of fullness, which is so important, again, as I was talking about in the root system, where when people overeat, sometimes to feel that sense of heaviness, grounding, fiber can actually do that for us. Fiber can give us that sense of fullness. It can help to retard stomach emptying, delay intestinal transit, so things move slower, which can be better for digestion rather than rapidly moving things through. And that is so good for the fire system. It's so good. It can also be helpful for blood lipids and adding bulk, creating better bowel movements, and balancing the intestinal milieu through the action of the different bugs that are working on the fiber. So all around a good thing. While we are on carbohydrate, I do want to talk about something that's been very popularized, the FODMAPs diet. Just like I talked about the ketogenic diet when we were talking about fats and oils and flow, I do want to mention FODMAPs. What is FODMAPs? It stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. It's right there on your slide. So in this particular diet, people are advised to avoid carbohydrate, even the fruit and vegetable kind, in order to prevent a lot of the things that can happen when digestion is not optimal, such as bloating and swelling and gas. And so typically in people with irritable bowel syndrome or in small intestinal bowel overgrowth, sometimes these folks are recommended to follow a low FODMAPs diet. I'm not a huge proponent of it because I feel like so many great food categories are being left out. The ones I know and love, the colorful ones. And so when a person has a lot of bloating and gas and indigestion, I'd rather focus on working on the root cause, digestion. And I do understand that it might make sense to take out some carbohydrates initially to get things better, because some people are so uncomfortable after they've eaten. It's almost like they feel, I had a client years ago who was not overweight in any way. She wasn't pregnant. She took a picture of her belly area before and after she ate. And before she ate, it was just, no bloating, just flat tummy. After she ate, it looked literally like she was 7 months pregnant. And she said it would not dissipate for hours. And then she'd have another meal. And that just makes you, when you don't feel good in your gut and you've got bloating and abnormal heaviness that just, after you eat a meal, it just doesn't feel right. It just doesn't lead to good appetite at the next meal. So now everything metabolically is kind of thrown off. So some people, I do understand, they receive benefit from avoiding certain carbohydrates because digestion in some way, or the gastrointestinal tract in some way, is not optimal. There could be dysbiosis, meaning bacterial overgrowth, or lack of proper enzymes, amylases as one particular enzyme to break down carbohydrate. Maybe they're lacking certain things. So again, I wanted to mention that for you because it's very relevant based on what we're talking about. It's a FIRE type of dietary protocol to get people back on track with digestion. So these are some examples of what are being left out. So foods with fructose, vegetables, legumes, a lot of different things. So this is a very difficult diet to follow as well. And the way I see it, it's a therapeutic diet. It's not something that people are on forever. It's something like the elimination diet where you interject with something to remove foods in order to get clarity on symptoms and what's happening. And then you start to add them back in. So that's why I see this as more or less a temporary way to be eating while digestion and processes are being worked on. All right, and then yellow foods, the color code, as I mentioned, digestion. And when you feel out the color yellow, there are studies on this. The color yellow is all about happiness, being cheerful, bright. Think of a sunny day, think of a smiley face. And so yellow foods, there are many yellow foods that may not be as health promoting, right? Yellow is a color that so many people gravitate towards. And again, me working for a large food company, getting a window into marketing of food and colors of food and how to move people in, it's no wonder that we have a spectrum of yellow foods, some of which are very highly processed carbohydrate. And then you have all of these, which are naturally occurring foods with varying levels of different types of carbohydrate. And some of these listed here are green. And under the green, you do have yellow. In fact, the greens are, in my opinion, many of them are superfoods because under the green, you have a little bit of a rainbow. You have many times red, orange, and yellow. And in fact, in the article that I wrote called The Science of Eating a Rainbow, I introduced something called color density index, where you could see which foods qualitatively had more of the spectrum of colors. And there are some foods, there were a handful of like 5 foods that contained even blue purple. They contained all of them. So I was saying, these are the foods we need to focus on that give us all of the pigments that we need for health. So one of the yellow pigments is lutein and zeaxanthin. And lutein embeds into primarily fat tissues in the body. It is fat soluble, so it likes to go into the brain, likes to go into the macula of the eye. It goes into breast tissue. It goes into skin tissue. Wherever there's fat, typically you find lutein. And when I think of a high lutein containing food, most people think of kale. And kale is, if you look at this chart here, it is pretty high in lutein. There's a nice range here, 48 to about 115. But there are other foods that contain lutein as well. And so I have this feeling and theory that parsley is like the next kale. Just like there are many different kinds of kales, there are many different kinds of parsleys, and parsley is incredibly rich in lutein. and really rivals kale. So I just find that it's kind of interesting, right? Now, the other thing I wanted to mention by way of talking about the fire is the concept of flow and fire. Flow meaning adipose tissue in the body, and fire being the mitochondria. And if you think of infants when they're born, infants tend to be higher in fat relative to muscle. The type of fat they have, however, is quite different compared to when they become adults. It's more brown fat. It's brown because of the concentration, the number of mitochondria in that fat tissue. It becomes very warm, very metabolically active because of all of these burning mitochondria in that fat tissue. And the reason for that, giving energy, right, to a newborn. Now, as we become older, we start to get a shift in the type of adipose tissue we have. So we move away from the brown fat into more of the white adipose tissue, which is more of a storage depot of fat and less of a metabolically burning fat. What's been coming out in the literature that I think is really interesting, and I give credit to Jeff Bland, who mentioned this to me some years ago, is that there is a way to transition white adipose tissue into more of the brown adipose, the thermogenic tissue. And that process, it's like a spectrum, and it's called beiging. Not like Beijing, China, but like the color beige. And so moving from white to tan or beige and into brown. And there are certain things that can facilitate that process, like physically being active. So through exercise, we create more mitochondria. We can also do it in a more passive way through food. So there are different, and we wrote a whole blog on this because I was very interested after Jeff had mentioned it. I thought, what are these foods that do this? And some of the foods are warming. Now, a lot of this is in cell studies and not in clinical human trials. So we don't have indication in humans, but we do have indication in cells and in animals that things like cinnamon and resveratrol can help to promote that transition between white and brown adipose tissue. So essentially heating up the fat tissue. And just a side note here, even though we're primarily focused on yellow as the color, I often put, because some people will ask me, Deanna, well, what about tan or brown? Depends on the food, but I do often put tan or beige foods in here into the fire bucket as part of the spectrum of yellow. Sometimes it depends on the food, and I have a whole chart of those foods in the Rainbow Diet book in the back. So as an example, like mushrooms, I put into the root, and that's primarily not because of color, but because of what they're about. Decomposition, immune modulation, a lot of the energetic themes are connected to root. Another thing to be aware of is that some of the compounds derived from yellow foods, like naringenin, which comes from citrus, when we have naringenin in isolation, it can help to stimulate a lot of the metabolic pathways inside the cell. So there is kind of this mother protein called AMP kinase, and it leads to more metabolic efficiency. And naringenin sparks that pathway. And that has been shown in cell and in animal studies. And so it's interesting to look at naringenin. You know, if you reflect on the grapefruit diet from years ago, you know, how extreme and excessive. But I do think, based on what I see in the literature, that there can be things from these whole foods that are doing multiple things. I mean, the beauty of plant foods is that they're intelligent, they modulate, they adapt to what we need rather than just hammer on one particular pathway and shut it down or turn it all the way up, which many times a pharmaceutical will do. And in many cases, that could be appropriate, and that's what we want. Plants are different. Sometimes we don't get that full all or nothing response. We get a bit more lighter modulation because it's connecting into our body pathways at multiple levels. So I really like this idea of citrus fruit containing actives to help us to burn brightly in terms of metabolism. And also, when I was doing a lot of the research on these yellow foods, one of the things that I also found was that taking in more citrus fruit can help to reduce the risk of gastric cancer, stomach cancer. So that was interesting to see. Honey is such a great yellow food from the perspective of it being a sweetener and being yellow. I am a huge fan of honey. It has multiple effects. It is doing so much at the level of whether it's being an antiviral, antimicrobial. It's depending on the kind of honey, of course, because you can have some that are more immune active. I usually like to buy local honeys that are less refined and processed. And, the bee is a fire animal. It's yellow. It's even yellow, and it produces yellow stuff. It produces honey. It produces propolis. You've got royal jelly. All these things are bee pollen. They're all yellow. And so these are powerhouse foods. I feel it when I have honey, when I have bee pollen. In fact, you have too much bee pollen, it can become quite aggressive. There are some hormonal effects. And so be very conscientious, whatever food you're taking in whatever doses. I mean, food is medicine, and it can affect pathways. It can affect metabolism of pharmaceuticals. This particular study, what I liked about this is that it's also a detox agent. Honey inhibits and repairs pesticide damage from glyphosate and chlorpyrifos. Fascinating, right? And if you start, I'm not going to show you them here, but if you look at some of the other studies on honey, what you can also see is that it may have some anti-diabetic action. So usually diabetics refrain from all sweeteners, but there may be certain things in certain types of honey that can help us to be more, again, metabolically efficient. And in terms of the glycemic impact of honey, it kind of depends on the honey, whether it's more refined or less refined, but usually it's in the middle. It's around the middle area, kind of moderate in glycemic impact. And again, I see it relatively as a whole food, depending on the format that you get. Royal jelly is also something made by bees. In order for a bee to become a queen bee, she needs to have royal jelly. What is in royal jelly? A lot of different things, but B vitamins are something that are rich in the royal jelly medium, very rich. And so it could just be simple methylation. There could be other things there. I know that in Asia, they look at royal jelly as a vitality agent. It's coveted. So this was a small study, 6 healthy men who were given royal jelly every day for 14 days. They looked at blood samples, divided them into control and a group where they irradiated their blood through X-ray. And they found that the irradiated group after the royal jelly was actually more protected. So that's kind of interesting. Saffron, the beauty of a lot of the fire agents is that you just need a small amount, and that can help to move the dial quite profoundly. Saffron, very expensive, yellow, and we now know that saffron can be helpful for helping with metabolic syndrome, as well as there are some studies looking at certain constituents of saffron, like crocin, and modulating depression. So again, the gut being the seat of the mind, it is really no surprise to me that saffron would be implicated in something like that. This was a study looking at having yellow onion and giving that to people, and finding that having this yellow onion in higher amounts versus lower amounts helped with fasting blood glucose and insulin levels over the period of the study. Pineapple juice is rich in certain enzymes that help to break down carbohydrate and protein. So it's really interesting to see that there were a few studies in which they would give pineapple juice before some type of gut procedure to facilitate the breakdown of any leftover stomach contents. I love pineapple. I just had some this morning, some fresh pineapple. It's just such a great summer fire food. And ginger. Ginger is also great in a variety of different ways. It is helpful because it can impact motility of the gut. It can change, especially like the upper gut, the stomach area. So that's why ginger tea or extracts, even whole food form ginger, is often given for nausea, can help with a variety of these different ailments that are all epigastric, like belching and dyspepsia and bloating and gastritis, but also things that are even lower down, things like constipation. But typically when I think of ginger, I think of the stomach. In fact, this reminds me, I probably need to have some more ginger. Got some great ginger tea. And so, you know, and you don't want to overdo ginger either, because even though it has great anti-inflammatory activity, it can, in excess, there are some side effects of shutting down certain constitutive enzymes relating to inflammation. That's one of the things that I learned in the supplement world. So what about yellow foods? Well, bananas are a source of serotonin. Serotonin, you may know, is a neurotransmitter. So it plays a role in our level of, if you will, happiness, just to make it easy. But what we don't know is if we eat foods that are high in serotonin, does that translate into more happiness? That we do not know. There is no science to suggest that. We know that we produce the most amount of serotonin in the gut compared with the brain, where we would think of that serotonin being produced and active, but we actually produce more in the gut. And if you look at the foods here on the far left that are highest in serotonin, we get plantains, pineapple, and banana, all yellow foods. And they're up there. You know, plantains are pretty high, and pineapple, not just being a source of bromelain to break carbohydrates down and proteins down, but also being a source of serotonin. So when I think of bananas, I think of the happy, smiley nature of bananas to remind us that it's a happy food. All right, so in closing here, there are some activities that you can explore, and you have these written out in your email. So do one of the three. I had three options for you here because I was thinking that the fire chakra is the third chakra. So you can do an inventory of your sweeteners. Perhaps you'd like to explore what you currently have on hand, or you might want to look at when you typically crave things that are sweet. Is there a pattern to your fire? Or you may want to look at doing a survey of yellow foods in your kitchen. How many do you have, and which ones give you energy and which ones take it away? When, if you're wanting something a little bit different and doing less active and more passive and just taking in information, I've got a couple of blogs that we had written up, one about the different fibers and how they have different qualities, and also reducing the fire in food by looking at how much heat we're applying to foods. That's important to be looking at. There's a nice article on fiber basics. If you do want to go into fiber a little bit more, I really like this Healthline article. And then I thought, for fun, check out World's Healthiest Foods as a website. It's one of my favorite sites for food information, and read a little bit about the healing benefits of lemons. For journaling, I was reflecting on how fun it might be to dialogue in your journal with sweetness. Sweetness as an actual entity or energy. So that's why I capitalized the word sweetness here, because what would it be like if you were to talk with the quality of sweetness and you had a conversation? What does he or she look like? Is it a he or she? Is it an animal? Is it an object? What does sweetness look like in your life? How do you dialogue with that quality that all of us are drawn to and are inherently within us? Partner activities, do whatever you feel here, but in general, what I was thinking is to talk about your relationship with sweeteners and or sweetness. So enjoy the week of fire and food, getting into yellow, getting into sweetness, embracing carbohydrate for your body in whatever way, shape, or form that might mean. And share as much as you'd like to on the Facebook page to see what your discoveries and what you're unveiling as part of that process. So thanks, everybody. Have a great week.